We begin with breaking news in the impeachment inquiry into President Trump and an admission by a top Trump aide that he told the Ukrainians if they wanted $400 million in aid from the U.S., they would need to publicly announce they were investigating the Ukrainian firm Burisma. And, as he also put it, quote, Burisma equals Biden. It's all part of the release this afternoon of two explosive transcripts related to the Ukraine scandal. Kurt Volker, the former U.S. Special Envoy for Ukraine, and Gordon Sondland, the U.S. Ambassador to the EU, testifying as to their discomfort as President Trump pushed them to his personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, and Giuliani pushed them to get the Ukrainians to announce an investigation into Joe and Hunter Biden. As Sondland put it, quote, it kept getting more insidious as the timeline went on. That is the word that President Trump's own ambassador that he appointed used, insidious. Though the deposition transcript was released today, Sondland was forced to revisit his earlier testimony from October 17th and amend it. Sondland is now acknowledging that he informed a top aide to the Ukrainian president of this quid pro quo, aid for investigations, and that he had that conversation with the Ukrainian aide on September 1st, when the aid was still being withheld, the military aid. In other words, it's not true that the Ukrainians did not know that there was this alleged attempt to force them to investigate the Bidens at the time. Sondland calling the, quote, demands by Trump and Giuliani to have Ukraine investigate the Bidens improper and potentially illegal. Quote, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know the law exactly, Sondland said. It doesn't sound good. CNN's Alex Marquardt kicks off our coverage today.
In black and white, one of the president's top envoys changing his testimony, now admitting he told Ukraine's leadership that hundreds of millions of dollars in military aid were being held up until President Trump got the investigations he wanted. Ambassador Gordon Sondland, who's a longtime Republican donor turned diplomat who gave money to Trump's inaugural committee, amending his original testimony, writing, I now recall speaking individually with Mr. Yermak, where I said resumption of U.S. aid would likely not occur until Ukraine provided the public anti-corruption statement that we had been discussing for many weeks. That public statement that Trump wanted, according to the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine, was that President Zelensky go to a microphone and say he is opening investigations of Biden and 2016 election interference. Those investigations were being pushed by the president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani.
There's really only one story. All of the witnesses agree that the president engineered a shakedown of the Ukrainian government.
In Sondland's transcript released this afternoon, when asked if what Giuliani was doing was illegal, Sondland responded, I assume so.
That's illegal. You cannot solicit a foreign power to investigate American political parties or your American political opponent.
Over time, Sondland said things got more insidious. The demands on Ukraine bigger and bigger, and Ukraine would have to play ball before the Ukrainian president got a meeting with President Trump. The problem grew for the State Department, which was fully aware of what Giuliani was doing, Sondland said. And when Sondland raised it with his boss, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Pompeo rolled his eyes and said, yes, it's something we have to deal with. Another member of the trio in charge of diplomatic relations with Ukraine was former Special Envoy Kurt Volker, who, according to the new transcript, told the Ukrainians about the Giuliani factor and described the extent to which Giuliani controlled Ukrainian access to Trump. The Ukrainians believed that by speaking to Rudy Giuliani, they could communicate to President Trump. Volker was asked. That information flow, he answered, would reach the president.
And the president's spokesperson has just responded to these transcripts released today. Stephanie Grisham saying they, quote, show there is even less evidence for this illegitimate impeachment sham than previously thought. She also highlights parts of Sondland's testimony where he's uncertain and adds no amount of salacious media-biased headlines, which are clearly designed to influence the narrative, change the fact that the president has done nothing wrong. Jake?
Alex Marquardt, thanks so much. Let's chew over all this. And I want to dive into the section where Sondland, the president's ambassador to the EU, uses the word insidious. He says, quote, this whole thing was sort of a continuum. It started as Trump saying, talk to Rudy. Then, let's get the Ukrainians to give a statement about corruption. And then, no, corruption isn't enough. We need to talk about the 2016 elections and the Burisma investigations. It kept getting more insidious as the timeline went on. And then at the end of that continuum, I became aware that there might be a link between the White House visit and aid to the Ukraine that was being held up. David Urban, you're a 2020 Trump campaign advisor. Insidious is Sondland's word, not Adam Schiff's, not the media. It's Sondland.
Yeah, so a couple things about Ambassador Sondland, right? So, interesting that his, goes back to correct this. I think Ambassador Sondland may have an issue with have perjured himself in one case or another, so he may be facing some legal jeopardy of his own to begin all this. But, I don't see in here, and Jake, I didn't, I'm just reading the excerpts, right? But I don't see in here anywhere where it says, the president told me to do X. President told it's
he says
right.
The president told him to go to Rudy,
right.
And then Rudy did
all
this.
He said, what did he talk to Rudy about? What? And he said, I don't even know. I wasn't even sure what to talk to Rudy about. And this is the Sondland's testimony says, I was unclear what I was supposed to talk to Rudy about. So the connection between the president and where Sondland thinks he is, there's a giant leap.
What do you think?
Needs to be filled in.
I mean, giant leap is interesting given, as you say, this is no longer a case of, we talked about this last week when I was on the show, never Trumpers. Trump made this smear of Alexander Vindman, the NSC guy, and Bill Taylor, the acting ambassador to Ukraine, saying they're never Trumpers with no evidence for that whatsoever. Now we have Sondland. You can't call him a never Trumper when he donated $1 million to Trump's inauguration committee and was rewarded with this plum ambassadorship.
He still works for
to the EU. He wasn't qualified to be ambassador to the EU. Fiona Hill testified that she was worried he was a national security risk. But Trump gave him that job. Trump told him to talk to Rudy Giuliani. Rudy Giuliani, we know, is in a lot of trouble with some of the nonsense he said from the testimony that's come out today, the conspiracy theories that they were pushing. And I think, the problem now is that, everybody who's come before this committee, pretty much everybody, has either said they have a problem with the phone call or that the phone call was, when they saw the phone call, it was an issue. And that's why the Republicans, we've discussed this endlessly here, keep attacking either witnesses or the process or Adam Schiff or the media or Stephanie Grisham, because there's really no counter-argument in terms of what's been seen.
So I want to bring other people in. I'll come back to you. So Sondland told, this is what a lot of people think is the most important line in all the testimony. And David's right. He did have to amend his testimony, and there were questions about whether he had perjured himself, and so he went back. And this is what he says. He's talking about September 1st. He tells a top aide to Ukrainian President Zelensky, and he says, I now recall speaking individually with Mr. Yermak, that's the aide to the Ukrainian president, where I said the resumption of U.S. aid would likely not occur until Ukraine provided the public anti-corruption statement that we had been discussing for many weeks. And we know that that anti-corruption statement has to include the 2016 election and Burisma, and as Sondland puts it, Burisma equals Biden.
Well, this is why the idea of a quid pro quo is becoming such an uncomfortable point of discussion, particularly for Republicans on Capitol Hill. And we reported last week that there's actually been a shift in the Senate Republicans' messaging. It goes against what the president has been saying all along, that in this perfect call, there is no quid pro quo, that there hasn't been any. But we have a growing number of GOP senators saying, well, looks like there was a quid pro quo, but it's okay because A, it's not impeachable. B, the president didn't seem to have a criminal intent here. He wasn't acting on corrupt purposes. And C, it happens in foreign policy all the time. A couple problems with that, obviously, it goes against what the president has been saying. And it just also shows how, when the president is asking his defenders to defend him on substance rather than process, it becomes a tricky thing for a lot of Republicans. I think that's particularly why Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who is not, to be fair, a talkative person to begin with, finally said today during his weekly news conference that he's not going to comment on the daily drips coming from the testimony. He'll just stay out of it for now.
So, David, I know you were talking about the excerpts. So the hundreds of pages of transcripts, what Sondland says is these instructions about what the Ukrainians need to announce is coming from Rudy. So Trump tells him to talk to Rudy, and Rudy makes these demands.
Right.
That's the insidious timeline.
Again, and so I guess, to my point on the evidentiary basis of this, right, there still is no smoking gun in effect of...
There's no phone call.
Yeah.
Let's not forget a phone call.
No, but my point is, again, and this is all great, right? But I don't hear one Republican today changing their position in the House. I don't hear one senator saying they're going to vote for conviction now. This is just a lot of white noise still.